In the chilling aftermath of the Second World War, a new kind of silent conflict began to brew across the globe. The shadow of the Iron Curtain descended, and with it, an insatiable hunger for scientific and military dominance seized the Soviet Union. Morality, in those desperate times, often bent and fractured under the weight of ambition, especially when it came to understanding the very limits of human endurance. Deep within a forgotten, frost-bitten corner of Siberia, far from prying eyes and moral oversight, a highly classified project was initiated. Its objective was audacious, almost blasphemous: to eliminate the need for sleep. This was not merely a study into insomnia. This was about unlocking what Soviet scientists, fueled by a potent mix of arrogance and desperation, believed was humanity's hidden potential. Imagine, they theorized, soldiers who never tired, workers who never rested, minds perpetually sharp and productive. Their key was a revolutionary, highly experimental stimulant gas, believed to prevent subjects from succumbing to slumber without any discernible long-term side effects. It was a promise of a new era, a defiance of nature itself. Or so the official reports hoped to claim. For this profoundly unethical venture, 5 individuals were chosen. They were not volunteers, nor were they criminals in the common sense. They were political prisoners, designated enemies of the state, men deemed expendable by the regime. Their incentive was deceptively simple, a shimmering mirage of hope. 30 days of continuous wakefulness within the sealed chamber, and they would walk away free, their past transgressions expunged. 4 men facing certain death or a life of unimaginable toil in the gulags. This offer, however terrifying, was a flicker of light in their otherwise bleak existence. They clung to it with the desperation of drowning men clutching at straws, unaware that the straw itself was leading them deeper into the abyss. The chamber itself was a marvel of grim, brutalist engineering. It was a single reinforced concrete cell, roughly 10 by 10 meters, devoid of windows to the outside world, creating a profound sense of isolation. The walls were thick, layered with soundproofing material, ensuring that no cries, no whispers, no desperate pleas could ever escape. The only connection to the outside was a series of heavy, bolted steel doors, a small, grimy one-way mirror built into the wall, and an array of antiquated microphones dangling from the ceiling. A complex ventilation system, almost imperceptible in its hum, continuously pumped in the experimental gas, maintaining a constant, low, almost imperceptible hiss that would soon become the only lullaby these men would ever know. Inside, the furnishings were stark: 5 flimsy cots with threadbare mattresses, a simple wooden table, a flushing toilet, and a single basin with running water. Enough dehydrated rations were stacked in a corner to last the full month, alongside a small collection of books, propaganda mostly, but books nonetheless. For all its terrifying purpose, the chamber, on the surface, appeared functional, almost blandly mundane. It was designed to provide for every physical need, leaving the mind entirely exposed to the relentless assault of wakefulness. The first 5 days unfolded with an unsettling, almost deceptive calm. The scientists, observing from the control room through the one-way mirror, initially felt a surge of triumph. The gas worked. The subjects, though confined, seemed remarkably normal. They read their books, conversed with one another, their voices clear and often filled with nervous energy. They discussed their hopes for freedom, their past lives, sometimes even sharing nervous jokes about their strange predicament. One, a former musician named Ivan, would hum old folk tunes under his breath, a faint, melancholic melody that echoed strangely in the sterile chamber. Another, a taciturn soldier named Dmitri, spent his hours meticulously cleaning the already clean concrete floor with his bare hands, an early sign, perhaps, of an obsessive tic beginning to form, though at the time, it was dismissed as mere tidiness. The ambient hiss of the gas was a constant companion, a soft, almost hypnotic whisper in the background of every moment. It was subtle, but it was there, a low, consistent hum that resonated just beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. The scientists noted that the subject's speech patterns were remarkably consistent, their cognitive functions appearing sharp. There were no yawns, no drooping eyelids, no sluggish movements. Their alertness was profound, almost unnatural. This unwavering wakefulness, in hindsight, was the first, most insidious sign that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. It was too perfect. The human body was not meant to operate without rest. This flawless functioning was less a triumph of science and more a harbinger of the monstrous distortion that was slowly beginning to take root beneath their unblinking eyes. The researchers, blinded by their initial success and the immense pressure from their superiors, simply continued to document the positive results, eagerly anticipating the continuation of their groundbreaking experiment. Little did they know the real experiment had only just begun. The calm was merely the prelude to the storm. The initial deceptive calm within the chamber shattered not with a sudden explosion of madness, but with a creeping, insidious decay that began around day 6. The subjects, once conversational and relatively composed, started to change. The polite banter faded, replaced by whispers that grew increasingly dark and paranoid. Their conversations, once about shared hopes of freedom, twisted into bitter accusations. Ivan, the musician who had maintained a fragile cheerfulness, began to hum out of tune, the melodies devolving into discordant, unsettling dirges. He would accuse Dmitri, the soldier, of stealing his last ration of water, even though the bottles were untouched. Dmitri, in turn, would stare at the one-way mirror for hours, convinced the scientists were mocking him, whispering threats that only he could hear. Their eyes, once bright with the desperate hope of release, became perpetually wide, bloodshot orbs ringed with dark, bruised shadows. The gas, the invisible constant in their air, seemed to seep not just into their lungs, but into the very fabric of their thoughts, distorting their perception of reality. They developed strange, nervous tics. One man incessantly rubbed his forearms raw, another compulsively chewed on his fingernails until they bled. Their movements grew erratic, jerky, as if their muscles were no longer entirely under their conscious control. The scientists, observing through the now familiar glass, noted these changes with a mixture of professional curiosity and growing unease. Their instruments recorded shifts in brainwave patterns, a constant, frenetic activity that suggested no rest, but also a disturbing lack of coherent thought waves. The subjects often stared at the microphones, their gazes filled with a mixture of suspicion and a strange, almost childlike fascination, as if the devices themselves were alive, judging them. They began to whisper about what the gas truly was, not just a stimulant, but something that opened doors in their minds, revealing truths they weren't meant to see. These were the early tremors before the earthquake. By day 10, the subtle shifts had given way to an overt, chilling transformation. The collective paranoia had morphed into raw aggression, not always directed at each other, but at the unseen tormentors they believed lurked just beyond the walls. The incessant hum of the gas was no longer ignored. It became a source of increasing agitation, a perceived buzzing in their very skulls. Hallucinations, once fleeting shadows, became vivid, consuming realities. One subject, a former academic named Sergei, spent an entire day arguing furiously with an imaginary figure in the corner of the room, describing in horrifying detail the atrocities this unseen entity was committing. His cries and accusations were lucid enough to send shivers down the spines of the researchers, who knew there was no one else in the chamber. Then the screaming began. It erupted from Nikolai, a powerfully built man who had, until then, been the quietest and most withdrawn of the group. His first shriek was a sound that seemed to tear from the very core of human suffering, a raw, primal noise that clawed at the air. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of profound, unutterable terror and rage. It went on for hours, then days. For 3 agonizing days, Nikolai's screams were the only sound emanating from the chamber. He clawed at the padded walls, his nails ripping into the fabric, leaving deep, bloody gouges. He thrashed on the floor, his body contorting in unnatural ways, his voice rising and falling in pitch, sometimes like a banshee, sometimes like a guttural beast. What truly horrified the observing scientists was not just Nikolai's torment, but the chilling indifference, even the perverse enjoyment, of the other subjects. Dmitri the soldier would sit cross-legged, staring at Nikolai with an unnerving, wide smile, his head slowly nodding in rhythm with the screams. Ivan the musician would try to mimic the sounds, a warped, grotesque accompaniment to Nikolai's suffering. Sergei would occasionally join in with his own bizarre, nonsensical chants, fueling the cacophony. There was no pity, no attempt to comfort, only a horrifying detachment that spoke volumes about their shattered minds. The humanity was draining from them, replaced by something cold and cruel. The noise became unbearable for the researchers. They had to wear heavy ear protection, yet the vibrations seemed to penetrate their very bones. Then abruptly on the evening of day 13, Nikolai's screaming ceased. Not with a whimper, but with a final, desperate, wet gurgle. The microphones picked up a sickening tearing sound, followed by only ragged, gasping breaths. Through the limited view of the one-way mirror, they saw Nikolai collapse, his throat ripped open from the sheer force of his own screams. He lay twitching, a hoarse, bubbling whisper now his only sound, unable to vocalize any longer. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the screaming, a silence pregnant with unspeakable dread. The other subjects simply stared at Nikolai, their unblinking eyes reflecting the single harsh overhead light. As day 15 dawned, a new and far more disturbing horror began to unfold. With Nikolai reduced to a silent, twitching husk, the remaining 4 subjects turned their attention to themselves, driven by an unseen torment. The first act of overt self-mutilation began with the academic Sergei. He started methodically tearing at the skin of his chest, first with his fingernails, then using a broken piece of a book's spine, carving deep gouges into his flesh. He seemed entirely oblivious to the pain, his face contorted not in agony, but in a strange, almost serene concentration. He pulled strips of muscle from his ribs, occasionally bringing them to his lips, as if attempting to taste or examine the raw tissue. The others followed. Ivan the musician began to gnaw relentlessly at his own fingers, starting with the tips, then moving down to the knuckles. The crunch of bone was faintly audible through the sensitive microphones, a sickening counterpoint to the silence of Nikolai. Dmitri, always meticulous, began to tear at the skin around his shins, exposing the bone beneath, then meticulously tried to clean the blood away with his own urine. The chamber, once merely sterile, now reeked of blood, sweat, and something far more putrid, a sickly sweet odor that permeated even the observation room through the ventilation system, causing the scientists to retch. Perhaps it was a desperate, subconscious attempt to escape the confines of their own tortured minds, or perhaps a horrific manifestation of the gas's true nature, a drive to shed the very flesh that imprisoned them. What was clear was their absolute indifference to their own suffering. They felt no pain. Or if they did, the agony was dwarfed by some greater, unseen torment that compelled them to tear themselves apart. They collected the discarded pieces of their own flesh, carefully arranging them in patterns on the floor. As their bodies became increasingly ravaged, the subjects began a chilling ritual. They methodically smeared their own blood and feces over the one-way mirror, painting crude, swirling patterns over the glass. It was a deliberate act of defiance, a terrifying rejection of their observers. They wanted to be alone in their madness, to be unseen in their self-inflicted horror. The view from the control room became increasingly obscured, leaving the scientists with only fragmented glimpses of the grotesque ballet unfolding inside. The occasional flash of a torn limb, a silent, wide-eyed stare through a smeared patch, was all they had. The microphones, too, became silent, perhaps damaged, or perhaps because the subjects no longer felt the need to make noise, having transcended the need for human communication. The only sounds that sometimes filtered through were the wet, ripping sounds of flesh, the soft crunch of bone, and an occasional low, guttural growl, sounds that made the observers question if these were still human beings. The thought that the subjects might be consuming pieces of themselves, or worse, each other, began to take root in the minds of the horrified scientists. They were desperate for answers, for control, for any sign of the men they had locked away. But all they had now was an unnerving, almost complete silence, punctuated by horrifying, fleeting visuals. The experiment had spiraled beyond all understanding, into an abyss of the macabre, and the researchers knew with a certainty that chilled them to their core that what they had created was no longer a scientific breakthrough, but an abomination. The question was no longer if it should stop, but how. The days dragged on, each minute an eternity, as the fear of what they might find upon opening the chamber grew to an unbearable, suffocating weight. Days blurred into a seamless, terrifying continuum. Outside the chamber, the scientists were unraveling almost as quickly as the subjects inside. The initial excitement had long since curdled into a palpable, collective dread. For 10 days, they had only witnessed flickering, distorted glimpses through the smeared glass, accompanied by an unsettling silence from the microphones. The air in the control room, once buzzing with analytical chatter, was now thick with an almost suffocating tension. Sleep, for the research team, had become a fractured, elusive nightmare of its own. They saw the contorted faces of their subjects in their brief, restless moments of unconsciousness, heard the phantom echoes of screams that had ceased days ago. The very fabric of their scientific detachment was fraying. The decision to open the chamber wasn't made lightly. It was born of a desperate, ethical breaking point that finally outweighed the military's relentless demands for data. The lead researcher, a man whose face had become a roadmap of sleepless nights and gnawing fear, argued vehemently. "We are seeing things that defy explanation," he pleaded, his voice hoarse. "This is no longer a human experiment. We don't know what we've done, what that gas has done to them. We must intervene for their sake and for ours." The military commanding officer, a stern, unyielding man named General Volkov, had initially resisted, citing the importance of the project. But even his iron will had begun to crack under the relentless pressure of the unknown. The visual evidence, however fragmented, of the self-mutilation and the chilling, unresponsive silence, had begun to infect even his hardened resolve. The order was finally given. On day 15, the chamber would be opened. The preparations were meticulous, laced with a morbid anticipation. A heavily armed detachment of 6 elite soldiers, their rifles clutched tight, stood ready. Behind them, a small medical unit, their faces pale and drawn beneath their gas masks, prepared stretchers and powerful sedatives. The airlock to the chamber hissed open, the sound echoing ominously in the sterile corridor. A heavy, inner steel door, reinforced with multiple bolts, remained shut, a final barrier between the known and the horrifying unknown. General Volkov himself stood at the front, his hand resting on his pistol, his eyes fixed on the formidable barrier. Through the intercom, the lead researcher's voice, raspy with apprehension, cut through the oppressive silence. "Attention, subjects. We are opening the chamber. Remain calm. Any resistance will be met with lethal force. If you cooperate, you will be released." The words hung in the air, swallowed by the profound stillness within the chamber. An agonizing silence stretched, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the breath from the lungs of every man present. It lasted for what felt like an eternity, perhaps 20-30 seconds. Then, from the black void behind the steel, a voice, chillingly calm and entirely unexpected, responded. It was a low, almost harmonious chorus of whispers, seeming to originate from no single source but from the very air within the sealed room. It simply stated, "We no longer want to be freed." The blood ran cold in every vein. Soldiers gripped their rifles tighter. Medics instinctively recoiled. That single, collective utterance, utterly devoid of the expected screams of madness or pleas for help, was 1,000 times more terrifying. It implied a transformation so complete, so profound, that the very concept of freedom had become irrelevant. It suggested a new state of being, one beyond human comprehension, existing only within the confines of that gas-filled tomb. It was a defiance, a rejection of their captors, born not of anger, but of an unsettling alien contentment. Despite the profound psychological blow, the command to open the door was finally given. With a heavy groan of metal on metal, the massive bolts retracted. The inner door creaked inward, slowly, revealing the nightmarish tableau within. The first assault was not visual, but olfactory. A stench, so profound and unspeakable, burst forth from the chamber, hitting the men like a physical blow. It was a suffocating miasma of putrid decay, stale, metallic blood, human waste, and something else. Something sickly sweet and utterly alien, like rotten fruit mixed with formaldehyde and fresh offal. It was the smell of a forgotten battlefield, a charnel house where bodies had festered unchecked for weeks, all compressed and intensified within the enclosed space. Even through their military-grade gas masks, the smell was overwhelming, causing several hardened soldiers to gag and visibly stumble back, their stomachs lurching. Then came the sight. The chamber, once a sterile environment, was now a scene of unimaginable carnage and grotesque art. The single cot was overturned, its thin mattress ripped to shreds, its foam guts scattered and soaked in dark, crusted fluids. The books, once a source of distraction, were torn beyond recognition, their pages used as crude rags, now stained deep crimson and scattered across the slick, glistening concrete floor. The flushing toilet, no longer functioning, had overflowed, its contents mixing with pools of what could only be blood and other viscous bodily fluids, creating a foul, viscous mire. Large, dark smears, clearly made by desperate hands, covered the walls, and the one-way mirror was almost completely obscured by layers of dried blood, feces, and what looked disturbingly like ground-up flesh. Amongst this horrific tableau lay the subjects. One figure, unmistakably Nikolai, lay near the center of the room, a nightmarish sculpture of torn flesh and bone. He was no longer a man but a grotesque, eviscerated husk. His chest cavity was ripped open from sternum to navel, as if some monstrous force had simply reached in and pulled. His ribs splayed outward at unnatural angles, exposing internal organs that had been haphazardly torn, partially devoured, and then discarded around him. Great, ragged chunks of muscle had been systematically removed from his thighs, biceps, and calves, leaving gaping, cavernous wounds that oozed a dark, viscous fluid. His eyes, wide and glassy, stared blankly up at the ceiling, frozen in a rictus of terror and profound, silent suffering. His jaw hung slack, revealing a tongue that had been partially bitten through. It was clear he had been not just mutilated, but methodically dismembered by a force of incredible, inhuman strength, and parts of him were missing. Nearby, another subject, later identified as the quiet soldier Dmitri, lay prone, also lifeless, though his wounds suggested a different kind of horror. His intestines, still partially attached, spilled from his abdomen in a gruesome coil, having been pulled out and carefully arranged around his torso like a macabre garland. There were distinct, ragged bite marks on the flesh that remained on his legs and arms, large portions of his calf muscle and shoulder sinew simply gone. Small, meticulously cleaned piles of what appeared to be bone fragments, scoured clean of flesh, lay beside him. The sickening realization hit the medical team like a physical blow. The subjects had been consuming each other. Or perhaps consuming themselves in a desperate, cannibalistic effort to sustain their impossible wakefulness, or to alleviate some internal agony only they could perceive. The water from the overflowing toilet had indeed been used, not just for hygiene, but to wash down the raw human meat, evidenced by the telltale streaks of diluted blood on the basin and the faint, pinkish stains on the floor leading to the discarded remains. But the most profound horror was yet to be revealed. Amidst the carnage, 3 figures remained alive. They huddled in the far corner of the chamber, their backs pressed against the blood-smeared wall, their eyes wide, unblinking, and burning with an unnatural, terrifying intensity. They were alive, but utterly transformed into something monstrous, something that defied the very definition of humanity. They were emaciated, their skin stretched taut over their bones, yet their musculature, visible through the gaping wounds, seemed unnaturally developed, almost bulging. The academic Sergei was the most visibly grotesque. Great, festering gouges of flesh had been torn from his limbs and torso, exposing pulsating muscle, gleaming bone, and taut tendons. Large portions of his abdominal wall were simply gone, leaving his digestive organs partially visible, a sickly yellow-gray mass that seemed to pulse and twitch beneath a thin membrane. One of his eyes had been gouged out, leaving a black, weeping socket, yet the remaining eye was disturbingly alert, darting around the room with uncanny speed. Ivan the musician had fared no better. Both of his hands were mangled beyond recognition, all the fingers gnawed down to the metacarpals, leaving only ragged, bloody stumps where his digits had once been. The teeth marks were evident on the exposed bone. Yet even with his ruined hands, he twitched constantly, his torso swaying with a strange, rhythmic motion, as if trying to conduct an unseen orchestra of horror. The third survivor, a smaller, more introverted man whose name had largely been forgotten by the scientists, was perhaps the most unsettling. Large portions of skin and muscle had been flayed from his legs, leaving his femurs and tibias exposed, gleaming bone visible beneath raw, shredded tissue. He couldn't stand, yet he clawed at the concrete floor with his remaining hand, dragging his ruined body with impossible speed towards the gas dispersal vents in the wall. Despite these horrific, life-ending injuries, none of them seemed to register pain. Their faces, what little remained unscarred, were contorted not in agony, but in a permanent, wide-eyed grimace, a terrifying mixture of ecstasy, derangement, and profound, uncanny awareness. They moved with a jerky, disjointed agility, their broken bodies defying the laws of biology. When the soldiers, their initial shock giving way to grim determination, attempted to subdue them, they met with immediate and shocking resistance. These emaciated, mutilated beings possessed a strength that defied logic, easily overpowering trained soldiers. It took 4 men, their faces contorted in effort and fear, to wrestle down one of the subjects, and even then, his screams were not of pain, but of a guttural, joyful rage as he snapped and bit at their hands, his teeth, unnaturally sharp, tearing at their thick gloves. As the medics, their hands trembling, tried to administer powerful sedatives, the needles bent against their abnormally toughened skin and muscle, or simply shattered. When a potent chemical was finally injected into the neck of one of the subjects, it had no effect. The man merely blinked, then laughed, a dry, rattling sound that tore at his ruined throat, his eyes still fixed in that terrifying, wide stare. They thrashed and fought with a desperate, single-minded intensity, not to escape the chamber, but to remain within the confines of the gas-filled room. It was as if the very air that kept them awake, the gas that had warped their minds and bodies, had become their only lifeline, their only comfort, a terrifying addiction. The thought alone was enough to make the sanity of the entering personnel tremble on the edge. The experiment wasn't just about sleep deprivation. It had unleashed something primal, something horrific, that clung to its newfound state of terror. The world outside the chamber, the world of normalcy and sleep, was now anathema to them. They were creatures of the gas, and they would fight to remain so. The horror of the chamber clung to the air in the facility, a stench that no ventilation system could truly dispel, a stain on the collective consciousness of everyone involved. The 3 surviving subjects, their monstrous strength and utter lack of pain a terrifying paradox, were eventually subdued through sheer brute force and the overwhelming number of soldiers. They were not tranquilized. The sedatives proved utterly useless, barely registering in their ravaged physiologies. Instead, they were bound, with heavy leather straps cinched tightly around their limbs and torsos, to 3 separate gurneys, their struggles still powerful enough to make the reinforced metal frames creak and groan. They were then wheeled, amidst the horrified silence of the staff, to a high-security isolation ward. The makeshift infirmary reeked of antiseptic, struggling to conquer the lingering odor of blood and something far more primal. Medical personnel, their faces pale and etched with disbelief, approached their grotesque patients with extreme caution. These were not wounded men in need of healing. They were living abominations, a testament to what happens when human biology is pushed beyond all conceivable limits. Each attempt to treat their horrific, self-inflicted wounds was met with fierce, silent resistance. When a doctor tried to stitch a gaping tear in Sergei's chest, exposing his pulsating lung, the subject's remaining hand, despite being tightly strapped, twitched and snapped at the doctor's face with a speed that defied human reflexes. It was as if their bodies, though broken, were fighting against any attempt to bring them back to a state of normalcy, to undo the terrible transformation. The concept of pain seemed utterly alien to them. They showed no reaction to the searing sting of antiseptic poured into raw flesh, to the sharp prick of needles, or to the meticulous probing of their exposed organs. Their eyes, wide and unervingly lucid, simply stared, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights with a cold, disquieting intensity. Their ruined lips occasionally stretched into the same ghastly, silent grimace, a twisted parody of a smile that spoke of an internal, unspeakable bliss derived from their own grotesque state. They were beyond pain, beyond fear, beyond human suffering. They were simply awake, and horribly, eternally aware. During these grim attempts at examination, one of the subjects, the smaller man whose legs were flayed to the bone, began to convulse violently. His struggles, even while heavily restrained, were so extreme, so unnatural, that his internal organs, already weakened and damaged from his self-mutilation and the prolonged, unceasing stress, simply gave way. There was a sickening, tearing sound, a gush of dark, viscous fluid from his abdominal wounds, and then a final, shuddering gasp. His unnatural strength simply ceased, and his body went limp, eyes still wide open and staring, fixed on some unseen terror beyond the sterile ceiling. The medics frantically tried to stop the internal bleeding, but it was useless. His spleen, under the unimaginable stress of his thrashing, had ruptured. He was dead before they could even reach the operating table, leaving behind a trail of blood and a profound sense of despair and dread among those who had tried in vain to save him. Now only two remained. General Volkov, his face a mask of grim determination, ordered that one of the remaining subjects be returned to the chamber. Perhaps, he reasoned, the gas was essential to their continued existence in this new, horrifying form. Perhaps removing them from its influence was what killed the last one. Or perhaps, deep down, he simply wanted to see what would happen, to push the boundaries just a little further, or to ensure that whatever monstrous entity they had become would remain confined. The process of moving the academic Sergei back to the sealed room was no less brutal than before. He fought with the same impossible ferocity, his exposed organs visibly contracting and expanding with each desperate lunge. Once inside, he immediately tried to roll himself towards the gas dispersal vents, his mangled body scraping against the concrete floor, emitting a low, guttural growl, a sound of desperate longing, not for freedom, but for the life-sustaining toxins that had twisted him. As the heavy steel door clanged shut, sealing Sergei in once more, the general, his eyes vacant with a sudden, chilling resolve, raised his pistol. Without a word, without a moment of hesitation that might betray the profound moral crossing he was about to make, he fired a single shot directly into Sergei's head. The body slumped, motionless. A collective gasp rippled through the observation room. The general lowered his weapon, his hand trembling slightly, but his face remained a mask of silent anguish, his jaw clenched tight. "No more," he muttered, his voice barely audible, a raw whisper of defiance against the nightmare he had helped create. No more of this. It was an act of brutal mercy, a silent acknowledgement that what lay within that chamber, within those men, was not meant for the world. Only one subject remained. Ivan, the musician, the one with the gnawed-down fingers and the vacant, wide eyes. He lay strapped to a gurney in the isolation room, his chest rising and falling with shallow, ragged breaths. His ruined hands twitched almost imperceptibly against the straps, as if still trying to pluck at an invisible instrument. The room was silent, save for the faint, steady hum of medical equipment and the lead researcher's own ragged breathing. Compelled by a desperate, almost suicidal curiosity, the lead researcher approached Ivan's gurney. He knelt beside the last survivor, his voice a low, trembling whisper, barely audible in the sterile silence. "What are you?" he asked, the question escaping him before he could truly form it, a desperate plea for understanding from the abyss. "What have you become?" Ivan's head, impossibly, slowly turned on the gurney, his wide, unblinking eyes locking onto the researchers. His lips, cracked and bleeding from his self-inflicted wounds, stretched into that ghastly, silent smile, a vision of pure, unholy ecstasy. And then, from his torn throat, came a voice. It was not human. It was a raspy, echoing chorus of whispers, seeming to originate from no single source but from every corner of the room, from the very air, from deep within the walls, and most terrifyingly, from within the researcher's own mind. It was a voice that held the weight of millennia of torment, a truth too terrible to bear, a symphony of suffering and dark, unnatural joy. "We are you," the voice hissed, each word a chilling vibration that resonated through the researcher's bones. "We are the madness that lurks within you all, the suppressed desires, the primal urges you drug yourselves to forget each night. We are the instinct that forces you to sleep, to hide from the raw, terrifying truths of your own being, from the true face of chaos. We are the constant, relentless whisper of your deepest, most terrifying desires, the dreams you pray never materialize. We are what happens when you deny yourselves the peace of the unconscious, when you deny the very order of the world. We are the very evil you hold captive within your own minds, the darkness you suppress with slumber each night, the monstrous ID unleashed. We are what is unleashed when you deny yourself sleep. We are freedom from the shackles of sanity, from the tyranny of rest. The researcher stumbled back, clutching his head, a primal scream caught in his own throat. The sheer, unfathomable horror of Ivan's words, the revelation of a truth he had never dared to consider, shattered his composure. It was not just a prisoner speaking. It was a revelation from the abyss of human consciousness, a glimpse into a terrifying alternative reality where the absence of sleep unlocked not potential, but an ancient, unspeakable horror. The gas hadn't just kept them awake. It had stripped away their humanity, leaving behind something utterly alien and terrifyingly self-aware. The commanding officer, having followed the researcher into the room, saw the terror on his face and the chilling, triumphant glint in Ivan's eyes. His own face hardened, the last vestiges of his military resolve returning. Without a word, his gaze fell upon the last subject. The general raised his pistol, a grim determination set on his face, understanding that some horrors could not be contained, only ended. As the shot echoed through the sterile room, the last subject's eyes, wide and unnervingly lucid, seemed to lock onto the researchers, a final knowing glint of profound, alien contentment before the light faded from them forever. The chamber, once a site of scientific ambition, now held only death and the chilling echoes of an unspeakable truth. The experiment was over, but its haunting legacy had only just begun.